Is something missing in your artwork and you're just not quite sure what it is? Well, welcome to this pastel painting tutorial. I'm calling this painting Sweet Cottage Morning. And in this lesson, I will bring you into the studio and guide you through some of my tips and techniques to take your art from ordinary to extraordinary. I'm excited you've joined me today in the studio, and here we go. I'd like to start with sharing a little bit about my setup and, of course, my soft pastels and this beautiful reference image. This image is from Kelly Nestler. She's a patron of mine on my Patreon page, and I recently started something my patrons are loving where they can share their own reference images right within our Patreon family for each other to use. I just couldn't resist using her lovely photo. Now, these are the pastels that I chose ahead of time, and it looks like a lot. I did not use all of these pastels, and I may have added a few more along the way. And this little organizational tray that I have is from a palette box that I purchased on Amazon, and I love these because they're little drawers. You can use them to store pastels or other artistic elements, or pull the drawer out like I do and use it for a palette tray. I do like that you can buy multiples and stack them on top of each other as well. Now, if you want to find many of my Amazon products that I mention a lot and that I recommend, I have an Amazon shop, and I have these different idea lists, they're called, where I can display a collection of different products that I personally use. This one idea list is called Pastels and Painting Products. I have a lot of pastels that I use. Some are different degrees in quality from beginner to advanced, but I'll have a link to that in the description of this video. Now, if you're a patron of mine on my Patreon page, you will be getting extended content where I will guide you through not only my pastel selections, but also my secret little strategy for creating dynamic focal points by, yes, literally sketching right on your reference image. But not to worry, visitors and subscribers on the Monet Cafe channel, you'll have plenty of content here. The surface I'll be using for this pastel painting is called Canson Mitons Velvet. Everybody just calls it Canson Velvet. I love it. And I also love the fact that it's water friendly, so you can use all other kind of wet mixed media on this surface, not just soft pastel. But I love to create what's called an underpainting. I'm going to do a very simple one for this painting, and I'm going to talk you why I do it, and I'll tell you why part of this video is called What's Missing, why a beautiful underpainting can help you get that wow factor. I'm pointing out here the surface color. It comes in different colors, but I like the cream surface because, again, it allows me to tone my surface a different color. This is the pad that is 12 inches by 16 inches approximately, with 12 sheets in the pad. And you could use various mediums to tone this surface, but I'm going to use some acrylic inks. And I have 3 of them here, but I'm going to share in the description of this video my favorite 2 colors. And if you're not using a water-friendly surface, you could even use soft pastels just to tone your first layer. I'll talk about all of that more as I'm painting. And this is a very worn and used little tray or dish where I add my acrylic inks. And unlike watercolor, acrylic inks are permanent. So if you don't rinse your tray out fast enough, you end up getting it stained, but it doesn't affect this application process. My goal is to get a beautiful golden color beneath this painting, and this color is called Azo Orange by Amsterdam. And I'm just putting a few little drops into the 3 wells. This is the fluorescent pink, and I already put the red in the one on the right. Now, just so you know, I end up not using the red, and I'll explain why. But I need some water, of course. I need some brushes, and I end up only using that largest brush that you see there. And I wanted to do a little test. I had a little spare piece of this Canson Velvet, and I know that I want it to feel very luminous, not like thick and opaque, so I'm going to try it with water. Look how this color just explodes. One was the red, the orange, and the pink, and it looked too red when I combined them all together, even though I think I would like this color for another painting, so I end up just kind of playing around with the fluorescent pink and the orange. Now, the more water you add, obviously, the lighter it will get. And I wanted to go with a much lighter final result. So you'll see that when I apply it to the larger sheet, which I'm doing right now. And I didn't worry so much about the fact that my water was already kind of turned a little bit orange. And I'm very liberally applying water. I want this acrylic ink just to flow and really leave the luminosity of the paper kind of showing through, to be translucent. And this is the first point I'd like to share in the title of this video, what's missing, and just some simple things you can do to add a wow factor to your art. Creating a golden underpainting beneath landscape paintings is typically a great way to start. You'll see by the end of this painting how just that little influence of this golden color beneath the pastels makes the colors just pop. So that's tip number one to what might be missing from your paintings. I recommend you give underpaintings a try. And I pre-make or pre-tone sheets of different types of pastel papers. I even do my own homemade version that you can tell I love this color, and I have many videos sharing how to do this, and it's one of my favorite ways to start a painting. And could you start on just the Canson Velvet without toning it any color? Yes, you absolutely could. I just love this beautiful golden color underneath. And if you don't happen to have any water-friendly pastel paper, you can actually just blend soft pastels. You could apply a little bit of a golden color of different pastels and use some sort of blending implement. These are nice blending tools I use a lot. They're called pastel smoothies, and they come in a 3-pack, the ones that I get. And this, I think, is maybe the smallest one. But you could also use various other blending tools to tone your surface a nice golden color. I did begin with a sketch for this painting using a Prismacolor Nu Pastel, spelled N-U Pastel, not N-E-W. And why did I use pink? Well, I thought it would look nice, and it's much more fun than gray or black. And here you can see me really getting into the sketch and making sure I have this architectural element rendered correctly. Now, if you're a patron of mine, you're getting the sketch portion as well, where I talk a lot more about sketching and this process. You also will get the actual sketch to work from. And I'm sorry to keep talking about my patrons a lot for all of you guys here on the Monet Cafe channel, but they do subscribe to me, so they get extra content. And now it's time to apply soft pastels. But first, let me go ahead and tell you how to become a patron if you would like to get all of this extra content I'm always talking about. It's really easy and really affordable. It's only $5 a month. You can cancel at any time. You get all of the extra content. We have games, we have prizes, we have so many things, too much to mention here, but my favorite part is getting to see your work. It's just a happy place of all levels of artists learning and growing together. And last thing before we start, I promise, could I get you to go ahead and like this video? You can't believe how much that helps YouTube to share my video. And of course, subscribe if you haven't already. And I love to hear your comments. Tell me what you thought about this video, if you've tried some of these strategies already, or if you think they're going to help you in your next paintings. And here we go. I am first beginning. You see my little tray of pastels here of various colors and values. And I really did use a lot of the colors that I had in the palette. I may have added just a few more, but I didn't use all of them. So I know that looked like a lot of pastels. And now I'd like to share the second tip or technique to really make your painting stand out is to block in the hole. Work from the hole to the detail. And I can't tell you how my paintings looked so stiff and so tight. And if you like a painterly and impressionistic style like I do, this strategy is going to really take your art to new levels. Now, what am I doing? I am using my pastels. I don't have a really hard pressure. I'm resisting the urge to really fill in. When I was first starting, I would have pressed so hard just to cover up all of that surface, but that's not what we want to do, especially with this beautiful underpainting. So I'm blocking in large areas of this painting all over. I typically start with my darkest values first. And if you're brand new to my channel or pastel painting, it looks kind of like a mess when you first get started, but that is normal. It's like the adolescent stage of a painting. So this is going to lend itself to your painting feeling whole and harmonious with values and colors versus things feeling segmented or like a paint by number. So that's a tip that I highly recommend is embrace early that technique and strategy of blocking in and not adding too many details early on. Now I started to blend this in with that one tool I talked about early on called a pastel smoothie, and it wasn't blending great. This Canson Velvet is a rather smooth pastel surface. It's not overly gritty. So that's why I switched to this paper towel. And yes, sometimes you can use a paper towel to blend with. I just keep folding it to get a fresh, clean corner when I'm switching to a different color so as not to contaminate it too much. And what this is doing is just softening the painting. I still do have an influence of that golden glow underneath because I kept light pressure, and you'll see at the final, you do absolutely see that influence of the glow underneath. All right, so once I get most of this in, that was mostly my darks. Now I'm starting to work on my middle values, and this is still considered blocking in. Blocking in is getting the majority of the pastel surface or the surface, whatever surface you're working on, covered. And this works with various mediums, not just pastel paintings. If you like a painterly style, do the blocking in technique in acrylic, in oil. Watercolor is a little different thing, but we'll talk about that in another tutorial on watercolor. So you can see I'm adding middle values, and I'm also starting to establish some of my cooler colors and some of my greens. Now, I resist the urge to go too light too soon with my paintings. I reserve or preserve that for my final applications of light and color towards the end of a painting. Now, I quit using that one and this one because it was what I was just saying, a little too light too soon. So I'm using this pretty cool green. A cool green leans towards turquoise. A warm green leans towards yellow. So I'm just putting this into anywhere I thought I might have some shadowy areas of grasses. And I often like to think of it with this block-in stage of painting what's underneath first. So the things underneath are going to be deep roots, deep grasses, the shadowy areas inside of the trees and the branches. And those things are typically darker and cooler. Things are cooler in the shadows. Well, now I do have to block in this house. I was kind of avoiding it for a while. And I noticed that the roof in the reference image is gray. And as long as you get the value close, you can get creative with color. So that's why I leaned a little lavender with the roof. I thought it would be fun. And I'm just paying attention to my values. Values just means the lightness or darkness of something, or whatever values in the middle. And so I'm trying to be careful not to put values that would be too light in shadowy areas. And if you're brand new at painting and all this sounds like, oh my gosh, that's a lot, trust me, I learned all of this by myself online. I didn't have any art lessons other than the fact that I majored in graphic design in college, but I taught myself pastel painting online, and that's how my YouTube channel got started. I started sharing all about it. So I'm still just blocking in shapes and values. Shapes and values. I'm not thinking of everything as detail. I'm just looking at the big shapes. I am looking a little bit like I saw a little shadow underneath the eave of the house back there. I know this side of the house is a little darker than the front side, so I chose a value that worked. Even though it was a little warm or pinkish in tone, I could use it because the value was right. It was a middle to darker value, and I thought it would echo nicely with some of the magenta flowers I'm going to add later. Now I'd like to share my third tip or suggestion as to what you can do, maybe if your paintings are missing this, and I find this is a biggie. And that is to establish a focal point strategy. And I promise you, when I first got started painting, and for a long time, I just painted, and I kind of painted what I saw. And I knew there were things about a particular reference image that I chose that drew me into that image to begin with, but I didn't even know how to establish a focal point strategy, or that I should even do it. And over the years, I've learned about how important this is, and actually how easy it can be. And that, just so you know, is the full lesson over on my Patreon page for this particular painting. I talk so much about how to do that. I give my own little secret that I do often when I print out a reference image and I work the focal point strategy from the printout. But I'm going to talk a little bit about that right now as this painting is in process. And notice everything's kind of just blurry right now. Again, this is kind of still the block-in stage, keeping my pressure very light, but At this point, you should have already thought about what is going to be some of your focal point elements. Now, in the Patreon video, I talk about how I love to have a lead-in to my painting. So these beautiful flowers in the reference image are a great lead-in. And I talk a lot about how you don't want to add too much detail right at the very base of your painting or around the edges, because your viewer will get stuck. So we typically keep loose edges around our painting, and our details should be more fine-tuned in our focal point areas. So since I'm working on this cottage right now, it is kind of a secondary focal point area. And one of the strategies I will use to create focal point, there's a few of them, and it's also a game I have over on my Patreon page and a contest that we have going on to determine different focal point strategies. But one of them has a lot to do with contrast, and contrast of various things. One thing is contrast of detail. Anything that has a lot of detail is going to get more focal point attention. So my flowers that I will add later are going to have more detail. A few of them, not all of them. Or if I do it to all of the flowers, I've lost the whole idea of just having focal point energy, bringing the viewer into the painting. So I'll have a few of my main larger flowers leading the viewer in. I'll have them more detailed, and I'll lead them to my secondary focal point, which is this cottage. And that leads me to what I was going to say about the door and the little shutters. I gave them a contrast of color, and it's really something that's going to be different than everything else in the painting, that pretty turquoise on that peachy color. And when you think of contrast, it's not difficult. It's just something that's different. So again, my turquoise color of the door on the house is different. It's different than most of the other elements in the painting as far as just those colors juxtaposed to each other. Another contrast element is shape. And think of something that's different. This house is the only architectural, other than that little side building, I'll talk about that in a minute. It's an architectural structure on top of or in the midst of all of this organic matter. So it has a contrast of structure and type. It also has a contrast of size. It's pretty large, so it stands out more. Well, I'm going to use some of those same little contrast elements in the flowers. My flowers that will lead the viewer in, you'll see me paint them later, will have contrast of detail. They'll have more detail than some of the other flowers and grasses. They'll have a contrast of size. I'll have those flowers that are the focal point larger. They'll have a contrast of color. They'll have brighter, bolder, more saturated color than some of the other flowers. And those are just a few of the focal point elements that can really take your painting from just feeling a little flat or just no pizzazz to it to really telling your story. I love to use that expression when talking about focal point. You're telling your story. You're pulling the viewer in and using those focal point strategies to lead the viewer in ways that tell a beautiful story. I always think of it as poetic or like a song. And I am going to jump ahead a little bit just to get to the flower portion. And again, I had already worked out this focal point strategy before I started the painting, and I highly recommend that. Again, if you're a patron of mine, your version will show you exactly how I do that. And what I'm doing here is, notice I left some of the large flower shapes that I had pre-thought out a little bit blank. I liked that golden color showing through, but I put a little bit of dark down at the base. These flowers, even though many of them look light and bright and highly saturated, they do have some dark values kind of deep inside the flowers in the shadowy areas. And that's typically how we paint, not just in soft pastels, but with oil and acrylic too. Because it's an opaque medium, we can lay down dark colors first and layer our lighter values on top. So that's why I'm working dark to light. With watercolor, you typically do it the opposite way, light to dark. And so now I'm just adding the detail. Remember how I talked about focal point and a focal point strategy? These are the flowers that are my focal point flowers that are going to have a contrast of detail, more detail than other things, of other flowers. They're going to have a contrast of size. They're a little larger than some of the other flowers I will add, and a contrast of color. I'm going to have these flowers, I'm pressing a little harder. I'm going to have pastels that are a little more saturated, a little more vibrant, and that's going going to cause the viewer to go to those elements. It's just something that innately happens with us. It's not something you have to learn. People who aren't even artistic just naturally do this when we look at images. We go to things of high contrast. And if you would like to learn a little bit more about focal point in art, I have a video here on the free version of the Monet Cafe channel called 5 Ways to Create a Focal Point in Art. I really break it down, and I enjoyed creating this video too. So I'll try to put a link to this video in the description of the current video that you're watching right now. And now I'm going to jump ahead just a little bit and show you some of the other flowers that I've added. Now, a lot of these are going to be flowers that are going to be buried. Notice not every flower is like on top. Many flowers are down deep into some of the grasses and the deep roots. So they're going to be hidden. I'm going to cover up some of them with grasses and leaves. But I wanted you to notice how loose my strokes are here. Notice that these white or peachier colored flowers, I'm keeping the colors a little bit more neutral, even though some of them are lighter than the pink flowers, but my strokes are super suggestive and loose, not nearly as detailed as some of the pink flowers. Now I'm adding a little bit of darker values. I noticed that often when you start painting, I got in a lot of my darks. Like I said, I start with darks typically. Sometimes as you're working, you will see that, wow, the things you applied early on aren't as dark as you thought they were. Now I'm going to zoom in a little bit so you can watch how I'm making these grass suggestions, I like to call it, because I'm not trying to paint every grass blade or leaf or stem of these flowers. I'm literally just looking at the reference image, getting an idea of the shape of some of these, and I typically get my darker ones in first and then gradually add the lighter values on top, like you can see I've done here. But that leads me to my fourth tip, to have paintings that just stand out, that maybe your paintings were missing this. Again, especially if you like an impressionistic style, and that is loose strokes. Often we get so heavy-handed and overly detailed with our strokes that our paintings start to feel kind of bogged down. And you can see an example of that in the foreground of my painting, that I have very loose grasses, in directional strokes that accent my focal point area. And I don't have all of my strokes in the same direction. Now, I could add a whole lot of tips in this video about directional strokes and all kinds of other teaching elements, but I thought it would be good to keep this video just to 4 that you can work on. But also another thing about your strokes is keep a light touch, not too much pressure. Like I talked about in the beginning, you're going to reserve that for any little final, I call them sprinkles or icing on the cake at the end, where you really want to establish a few little focal point marks or strokes to your painting. And also another thing about the strokes that you make, obviously I think most people know prospectively things get smaller as they recede into the distance. Also, if you have a field that's really going very far into the distance, your marks become less vertical. They become more horizontal. So my mark making gets a little bit more flat and horizontal with grasses and things in the distance than it would with the foreground grasses that are much more vertical. And so now I am doing a little bit more of that focal point strategy, where I'm giving a little bit more shadow and dimension to these shutters and this door. And I really loved, where's that blue? Is that the one? No, this is it. This is just such a gorgeous turquoise. It's just very rich and saturated in color. I believe it's a Sennelier pastel, one of my favorite brands. And you can tell I've used it a lot because I whittled it down to almost nothing. Now I'm giving a little door frame around the door there. And also I wanted to just kind of lighten up the roof. It was just kind of blah, you know, it didn't have much detail to it. But also on that note, I don't want to add too much detail to it. Things in the distance, your eye is not going to be able to really see all that detail. So we just want to suggest it. Just like I was saying about the loose strokes being a strategy for a painterly impressionistic style, keep your detail to a minimum as things recede into the distance. Now, you are going to see me add a little bit more of a cobblestone look to that front of the building, but just like with this roof, I'm keeping it very suggestive. And let me go ahead and zoom in right now to show you that. I have just little horizontal marks. I added some that were a little darker up top because they were under the eave of the roof, and then a few other that were a middle value. And I'm not trying to recreate an exact brick pattern. I wanted, again, this little cobblestone look, but you don't have to have all of your marks exactly spelled out. And as a matter of fact, if you do, it's going to look a little bit artificial. You want it just to be very suggestive and subdued. Now, a few of my little stones or blocks, I wanted them to have a little bit of lighter highlights. So I have this little barely beige neutral pastel, just has a little bit of warmth, where I'm adding random marks to get a little bit of the texture. And now I'd like to zoom into the painting and talk about these strategies or tips that I have shared. First, I would like you to notice the underpainting. Can you see that little bit of golden glow showing underneath? I believe it just really makes your colors pop and your painting come to life. I also want you to notice the detail in some of the flowers, and as you get to the edges, the almost blurry, out of focus look. Those are some of those focal point elements I mentioned. We're keeping most of our detail and some of those contrast elements I talked about in our painting strategy, and also the contrast of the building. We have a contrast of shape, we have a contrast of color, and also one I didn't talk about, a contrast of element. It's the only man-made or architectural element in this organic meadow scene. Now, I would love it if you guys would give me your comments. I, of course, love to hear what you thought about this video, but I also really like it when you give me your suggestions as to what type of lessons you'd like to see, such as more beginner lessons. Now, let me leave you with this hopeful thought. Every painting begins with faith, trusting the next stroke will bring beauty to life. And I love this verse from 2 Corinthians, for we walk by faith, not by sight. All right, dear friends, I pray blessings upon you in art and life. Please become a patron if you like. Of course, subscribe and check out more of my videos. All right, everyone, as always, God bless and happy painting.